Good afternoon, everyone. If you're able, please stand for the posing of the colors and the national anthem.
Ready? Go.
Thank you, and please be seated. There's a correction from today's program, and that is that the director of the Navy Band is Chief Musician Nathan Bissell. Good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank all of you for coming to the 2014 Isle of Honor. It's an enduring tradition for the past 22 years, a tradition that reflects our community's values of family, spirit of patriotism, and volunteerism. Key Peninsula veterans, thanks each of you for taking time today to honor the men and women who have fought to uphold and defend the freedoms our founding fathers bestowed upon us at great sacrifice. Your presence here today reflects how deeply you understand the importance of honoring the men and women who answered the call of duty. Today, we ask you, in honor of who now serve and who have served, to take on an important task of keeping this tradition alive and vibrant within our community. Share with your children in your lives the respect you have for the men and women who fought for this country. Share your keen understanding of the sacrifices being made today by our servicemen and women who right now are risking their lives to preserve the ideals that we hold dear. When we look at these flags, we see an example of how this tradition of honor and respect is being passed down to the next generation. We'd like to thank the leaders and parents of the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, and the Cub Scouts who brought their troops here today to help place more than 340 flags here, honoring our community's fallen veterans. When our Scouts participate in traditions such as the Isle of Honor, it etches into their memory, a time when we as a community paused to honor those who served our nation. It is foundational to their citizenship as they grow to adulthood. Today, as we remember those who are no longer with us, let us also look forward and vow to be a community and a nation which every day welcomes our returning soldiers. Let us pledge to help them find their way back to civilian life, seek them out, and extend a compassionate helping hand. Support them in whatever way you can, and to help them heal so that they too can begin to enjoy the freedoms and the ideals that they fought and sacrificed for. Help and guide them on the path to fruitful, productive lives, for they are our next generation of civic leaders, statesmen, ambassadors, and caregivers. At this moment, in this hallowed ground, let us honor those who lost their lives in service of our great nation and rededicate ourselves to serving those who are returning home after sacrificing so much. I'd like to close my welcoming address with a poem by Will Matney. There lies within the tombs and graves bodies of real heroes whose spirits soar where mankind's borders do not exist. War is a concept of man, but their hearts and their souls are of God, and it is within that realm which they are protected by the freedoms for which they fought and died. Thank you. At this particular time, I'd like to recognize our distinguished guest, Aaron Boyle, as our guest speaker, and Pepper Roberts is one of the main leaders of the Wounded Warrior Project at American Lake Hospital. And I believe Mr. Larry Sequist is here, former U.S. Navy warship captain, Pentagon strategist, and Washington State House of Representatives, for our 26th legislative district. And we also wish to thank Mr. Stan Fleming, retired Brigadier General of the United States Army and Pierce County Council member, and also former Washington State House of Representatives representing the 28th legislative district. By remembering the names of our deceased comrades in one small way, We honor them for their contribution to our nation and to their part in securing our freedoms that you and I enjoy. Thank you.
I begin the Aisle of Honor roll call. Warren B. Jessup, United States Army. Thomas M. Mercer, United States Navy. Paul H. Binkley, U.S. Army. Ted R. Brown, U.S. Navy. T. Myron Knutson, U.S. Army. Robert Bell Davidson, U.S. Army. Orrin Van Nutter, U.S. Army. Eldon Nutter, U.S. Army. John Harvey Rust, U.S. Army. Harry R. Bishop, U.S. Army. Andrew Westron, U.S. Army. Jack D. Neiman, U.S. Navy. Everett F. Stinson, U.S. Army. J. H. Deal, Civil War. Ernest Wright, U.S. Army. Hudson A. Lackey, U.S. Army. Matthew Bliss, Civil War. Willard Carney, Civil War. George Klein, Civil War. Harold Smith, U.S. Army. Alfred N. Van Slyke, Civil War. Otto A. Bemp, U.S. Army. John Richard Sisson, U.S. Army. Waldemar B. Movil, U.S. Army. William J. Crevison, Civil War. Delmar L. Kautz, U.S. Navy. Terrence John Osborne, branch unknown. Charles Berger, branch unknown. Ray DeGouche, U.S. Navy. Roscoe Jones, U.S. Navy. Theodore Thompson, branch unknown. John Brandel, branch unknown. Ole Hingham, branch unknown. Edward J. Slinning, branch unknown. John Ritchie, U.S. Navy. John Strittmatter, U.S. Army. The following deceased are also branch unknown: Billy Fairburn, Harry Brandt, Harold Hansen, James Mojba, Isaac Allison, John L. Brooks. Henry Pohl, U.S. Army. Rollicky Glenn Rose, U.S. Army. Arthur H. Sommerfeld, U.S. Army. Clarence E. Schultz, U.S. Army. William C. Mann, U.S. Marine Corps. Morris E. Johnson, U.S. Army. William T. Jessup, U.S. Army. Gideon M. Davidson, Iowa Militia. Benjamin A. E. Davidson, Iowa Militia. William N. Davidson, Iowa Militia. Samuel S. Davidson, Iowa Militia. Arthur S. Dervay, U.S. Army. Richard D. Gabrielson, U.S. Navy. Walter A. Hallstrom, U.S. Navy. Lewis O. Olson, U.S. Army. Arthur Olson, U.S. Army. Henry Anker, U.S. Coast Guard. Robert H. Hager, U.S. Army, and Raymond E. Baker, U.S. Army. Frank F. Fusion, U.S. Coast Guard.
I have the pleasure of giving the second reading. Arnie W. Armour, U.S. Army. Harry T. Smith, U.S. Army. Ronald H. Chambers, U.S. Air Force. William J. Robertson, Royal Canadian Air Force. Austin R. Hall, Jr., U.S. Air Force. Giorgio Perze, U.S. Navy. Edward A. Baddock, U.S. Army. Lewis E. Sullivan, U.S. Army. A. W. Paul, Civil War. Ward Whitfield, U.S. Army. Glenn M. Whitfield, U.S. Navy. Irwin W. Whitfield, U.S. Army. Ray N. Fulberg, U.S. Army and Navy. J. A. Fulberg, U.S. Army. John K. Neby, Civil War, U.S. Navy, Medal of Honor. Clifford A. LeMay, U.S. Army. Gillum Frank R.F. Tank, U.S. Army. Samuel R. Kennedy, U.S. Navy. Eric B. Misner, U.S. Army. James W. Camp, U.S. Navy. Carl E. Frederick, U.S. Marine Corps. Herman Rothberger, U.S. Army. Elmer C. Reagans, U.S. Army. William H. McKean, U.S. Army. Robert F. Cody, U.S. Air Force. Eleanor B. Stock, U.S. Army. Orwin W. Dowell, U.S. Army.
John Shoemaker, U.S. Army Air Corps. Omer Joseph M. Gervais, Belgium Army. Albert N.F. Gervais, Belgium Army. Cyril A.M. Gervais, Belgium Army. Prosper T.A. Gervais, Belgium Army. Franz J.P. Gervais, Belgium Army. Arthur Burke, U.S. Coast Guard. Roy Harvey Smith, U.S. Army. Walter E. LaForce, U.S. Navy. Samuel E. Duskin, U.S. Army. Arnold Hood, U.S. Navy. William Caleres, U.S. Coast Guard. Alice Lee B. Duskin, U.S. Army. Charles E. Carlisle, U.S. Army. Stanley Goodyear, Royal British Navy. Donald K. Ross, U.S. Navy. Medal of Honor. Gottfried Jensen, Spanish-American War, Medal of Honor. Philip A. Lemon, U.S. Army. Robert G. Fields, U.S. Army Air Corps. Oscar Billings, U.S. Army. George Austin, Revolutionary War, Army. William D. Austin, the Mexican War, U.S. Navy. Rudolph V. Talick, U.S. Army Air Corps. James E. Brandt, U.S. Army. Alvin Jacobs, U.S. Merchant Marine. Larry B. Stewart, U.S. Army. Henry Sacker, U.S. Navy. William Mark Kuhn, U.S. Navy. Benjamin A. Edward, Revolutionary War, Army. George A. Jensen, U.S. Navy. Forrest O. Jensen, U.S. Navy. Ralph Ahrens, U.S. Navy. O.H. Christopherson, U.S. Army. William G. Christopherson, U.S. Army. Olaf H. Christopherson, U.S. Army Medical Corps. Kenneth A. Regner, U.S. Navy. Fern G. Kelly, U.S. Navy. Harmon Van Slyke Sr., the U.S. Merchant Marine. Hezekiah Davidson, the Revolutionary War. Louis Drager, U.S. Army. Charles E. Weiler, U.S. Navy. Dwayne D. Strittmatter, U.S. Army. Charles S. Gibson, U.S. Army. Eldon E. Curl, U.S. Army Air Corps. Harold O. McKinney, U.S. Army. George O. Dunn, U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force. Leslie P. Jones, U.S. Navy. Henry A. DeWitty, U.S. Navy. Mildred Penny Payne, U.S. Marine Corps. Frederick O. Payne, U.S. Army. Rita Flugar, U.S. Marine Corps. Mildred H. Hoagie, U.S. Marine Corps. Gwendolyn Brown, U.S. Marine Corps. Arnold P. Vitol, U.S. Army. Ladane F. Allen, U.S. Navy. Paul W. Wittenberger, U.S. Army Air Corps. John W. Paul, Spanish-American War. Julius A. Rickert, U.S. Army. Albert A. Rickert, U.S. Army. Marvin A. Rickert, U.S. Coast Guard. Walter E. Olson, U.S. Army. Earl W. Rapport, U.S. Navy. Cedric Roy Jopp, U.S. Navy. Walter Hilliard Jr., U.S. Army. Tyrus R. Swartz, U.S. Navy. Barton A. McGuire, Civil War. S. James Gilbertson, U.S. Navy. George E. Lund, U.S. Army. James H. Wooldridge, Sr., U.S. Navy. Wilbur D. White, U.S. Army. David G. Hull, U.S. Air Force. Stuart Powers, U.S. Army Air Corps. Jack A. Ramsey, U.S. Army and U.S. Coast Guard. Arvo H. Hendrickson, U.S. Army. Bernard A. Young, U.S. Army. Latty Bill Gray, U.S. Army. Woodbury H. Beale, Royal Canadian Army. Garner W. Beale, Royal Canadian Army. Charles Chuck Britt, U.S. Air Force. Ora A. Jones, U.S. Army. Edward D. Jones, U.S. Army. Robert D. McCain, U.S. Army. Henry H. Neiman, U.S. Marine Corps. Stephen Strittmatter, U.S. Army. And John R. Strittmatter, U.S. Army.
Bradley C. Wright, United States Air Force. Van S. Bogardus, United States Marine Corps. John J. Nelson, United States Navy. Timothy O'Malley, United States Army. Oscar William Johnson, United States Army. David A. Rickard, United States Navy Seabees. Richard L. Ratnich, United States Navy. Harry F. Thompson, Army. J. Russell Dervais, United States Air Force. Myron J. Williams, United States Marine Corps. Vernon F. Grosser, United States Navy Seabees. Alfred E. T. Buckle, United States Army. Roy L. Neiman, United States Navy. Leroy C. Glass, United States Army. Paul Froelich, United States Army Air Corps. Robert M. Barnes, United States Navy. Edmund V. Olson, United States Navy. Donald M. Palmer, United States Army. Dr. Dale Hatfield, Navy. Lynn W. Hatfield, United States Army Air Corps. Ronald A. Smith, Army. William K. Gantz, Navy. Dick Martin, United States Army Cavalry. James A. Martin, U.S. Navy. James R. Martin, United States Coast Guard. George Callan, U.S. Army. John C. Whitfield, United States Navy. Charles C. Fiano, United States Navy. Earl W. Fravel, U.S. Navy. Charles R. Beale, U.S. Army. Timon H. Fix, United States Navy. Judy N. Wilson, United States Navy Nurse Corps. Natalia A. Knox, U.S. Navy Nurse Corps. James C. Gaylor, U.S. Navy. Ethel Thor Nelson, U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Robert L. Beale, U.S. Army. Lauren Collin, United States Army. Charles R. Neiman, U.S. Navy. Alva E. Bard, Jr., United States Marine Corps. William D. Evans, U.S. Army. George H. Mills, Navy. Carmen P. Fiano, United States Army. Douglas Blundell, United States Air Force. Edward Kessler, United States Marine Corps. Donald B. Michelson, Army Air Corps. Ralph E. Chamberlain, U.S. Navy. William C. Adams, U.S. Army. Edward R. Adams, Army. Thomas H. Gaffney, United States Navy. John F. McFarland, Royal Canadian Air Force. William H. McKinley, U.S. Army Air Force. And last, Thompson Myers, U.S. Army.
Thank you. Continuing with the Isle of Honor. Ralph H. Kingsbury, U.S. Navy. Eugene A. Pascusi, U.S. Army. Fred Stroh, U.S. Navy. Harry Kelm, U.S. Army. Chester Van Slyke Jr., U.S. Army Air Corps. Richard Dick Ducumon, U.S. Navy. Harold C. Hazy, U.S. Navy. Chuck Marek, U.S. Navy. John A. Larson, U.S. Army Air Corps. Norman G. Wade, U.S. Navy. George E. Teagues, U.S. Army. Robert W. Irwin, U.S. Army. Arnold M. Jorgensen, U.S. Army. Earl L. Graves, U.S. Army Air Corps. C.R. Casey Adams, U.S. Air Force. Frederick W. Brunton, U.S. Army. Edwin C. Brunton, U.S. Army. Norman Anderson, U.S. Navy. David Stevens, U.S. Air Force. William A. Cromie, U.S. Army. Richard O. Floberg, U.S. Army. Alfred M. Jacoby, U.S. Navy. John T. Elmer, U.S. Army. John W. Barr, U.S. Navy. Donald J. Broadsack, U.S. Army. Roy G. Davis, U.S. Army. Jim L. Red Davis, Seabees. Louis B. Waddell, U.S. Navy. Timothy Waddell, U.S. Navy. Matthew J. Waddell, U.S. Coast Guard. George H. Drager, U.S. Army. Earl F. Knapp, U.S. Navy. Raymond Karlinzig, U.S. Navy. Terrence V. Taylor, U.S. Navy. Claude M. Kidd, U.S. Army Air Corps. Nicandro Zampini,
Army, World War I. George A. Taylor, U.S. Army. Michael E. Sukanik, U.S. Army. David C. Berry, U.S. Army. Otis Crooms, U.S. Army. Rayford Crooms, U.S. Army. James Crooms, U.S. Army. Harvey Tidrick, U.S. Army. Richard Koger, U.S. Army. Joseph S. Kuski, U.S. Marine Corps. Earl S. Butts, U.S. Air Force. David Dandy Davidson, U.S. Coast Guard. Reese Corbett Wood, U.S. Army. Carlos A. Kiesler, U.S. Army. John J. Becker III, U.S. Army. Noel T. West, U.S. Army. Ozzie Walsh, U.S. Army. Thomas R. Cromie, U.S. Army. And Robert V. Estes, U.S. Army.
Bard S. Coons, United States Navy. Kenneth V. Warner, U.S. Air Force. Edgar L. Rose, U.S. Army. Richard E. Provenco, U.S. Marine Corps. Peggy D. Schmidt, United States Navy Nurse Corps. Dwayne Swede Houghton, U.S. Navy. Donald Stevenson, U.S. Army. Ken Cox, U.S. Navy. Earl Plunger Campbell, U.S. Navy. Leonard C. Berg, U.S. Army. Carl D. Berg, U.S. Army. Eugene Berg, U.S. Army. Sonia L. Johnson, U.S. Navy. Robert or Delbert G. Johnson, U.S. Army and U.S. Navy. David J. Hayworth, U.S. Army. Dylan B. Colburn, United States Air Corps. William Nitz, U.S. Army. James R. Meany, U.S. Navy Seabees. Harmon Van Slyke, U.S. Army. Wesley G. Davidson, U.S. Army. Fergus N. Brown, U.S. Navy. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Thompson, United States Air Force. Kenneth A. Regner, U.S. Army, World War I, World War II. John Urim, U.S. Air Force. Andrew Dalsing, U.S. Air Force. Gerald R. Rengley, U.S. Navy. Stanley S. Paul, U.S. Army. Marcus Jopp, U.S. Army. Carl H. Nelson, U.S. Army. John C. Erickson, U.S. Navy. Marvin Eklund, U.S. Air Force. Russell Fulio, U.S. Coast Guard. John Lumsden, Royal British Army. Melvin Gabelson, United States Merchant Marine. Henry, better known as Hank Ramsdell, U.S. Army. Maurice Libby, U.S. Merchant Marine. Sharon Donahue, U.S. Marine Corps. William Davidson, Ohio Militia. Lewis Davidson, World War I. Don Davidson, World War I. John Eno, New York Militia. Thomas Crawford, United States Army. Charles H. Wadhams, U.S. Army. William G. Wadhams, United States National Guard. John Sullivan, Navy Militia. Reverend William C. Woodhams, U.S. Navy. Stephen C. Penny, U.S. Army. Aaron Litowitz, U.S. Navy. Keith Stiles, U.S. Army. Gerald, better known as Jerry Tyler, U.S. Navy. Ralph E. Harrison, U.S. Marine Corps. Dorothy T. Lawrence, United States Army. Wesley O. Peterson, U.S. Army. Paul R. Roeder, U.S. Army. Ronald Van Arsdale, U.S. Army. Richard Olson, U.S. Army.
To the soldier, you have been thanked many times over for your dedication, courage, and service. Now, I thank you for your sacrifice. The sacrifices you have made, leaving your friends and family to fight for whatever reasons. The sacrifices of bleeding, sweating, and crying as you wage war to defend your country, your family. Mainly tonight, dear soldiers, I write this poem to thank those of you who have died, those of you who have sacrificed your lives to protect our right to speak, to pray, to learn. It has been written, greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. So to you heroes, how great is your love. And though it may leave a great many people grieving for years to come, your sacrifice has truly honored your country, your culture, and your family. Your heroism will inspire children and adults to be as brave, as courageous, and as strong as you. Who knows if you, brave warriors, are able to see or hear this? But for those you've left behind, I know it matters. Whether you sacrificed your life on the battlefield or because of your time on it, this poem is for you. How brave, how courageous, how valiant are you. Though not all believe in wars, nor the reasons behind them, none can doubt your sacrifice, that you would stand tall to defend your country, to defend your family. And for those of us left here, we miss you. For wives, husbands, sons, daughters, parents, we long to see your face and feel your embrace once again. For those too young to fully appreciate your stories, your love, not realizing their precious value, we wish we could have had more. We wish we would have asked you more questions, listened more intently, waited longer before we wiggled from your embrace. And for your kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, we hear the stories, see the pictures, feel the love, and we wish we could have met you, gotten to know you, heard your laugh, listened to your jokes, known the person we are so much like. As a country, we grieve for you, love you, honor you. As a family, we lament our time cut short. Listen to the stories of your bravery, your courage, your heroism. Appreciate your sacrifice and your love. And now, dear sacrificial soldier, we stand for you, waiting until we can see your smiling face in heaven. And as we wait, we pray that God may bless you in his heavenly courts. Departed warrior, we love you. Fallen soldier, may God bless you.
Raymond Adams, U.S. Navy. Jim Hay, U.S. Army. James R. Adger, U.S. Army. John Glennon, U.S. Navy. Robert Ekrit, U.S. Navy. Louis Aguilar, U.S. Army. James A. Spearman, U.S. Army. John D. Spearman, U.S. Army. Marvin L. Eliam, Sr., U.S. Army. Roy T. Piercy, U.S. Marine Corps. Seth W. Sperling, U.S. Navy. David L. Olson, U.S. Navy. Howard G. Kingsbury, U.S. Army. Ben J. Bronis, U.S. Army. Donald D. Olson, U.S. Air Force. James R. Brooks, U.S. Navy. George B. Green, U.S. Army. Timothy L. Green, U.S. Navy. Everett S. Rogers, U.S. Navy. Robert E. Thorne, U.S. Navy. Joyce A. Thorne, U.S. Navy. Harold Joe Steiner, U.S. Navy. Bill R. Burke, U.S. Army. Brian G. Lizay, U.S. Navy. Rod L. Wood, U.S. Army. Robert W. Burgess, U.S. Marine Corps. Norman E. Hammond, U.S. Army. John W. Hammond, U.S. Marine Corps. David Till, U.S. Navy. And David Till, U.S. Coast Guard. Alice T. Sakanik, U.S. Air Force. Donald Jott, U.S. Army. Terry Brewer, U.S. Army. Mac D. Toller Couch, U.S. Army. Jack Barrios, U.S. Army. James L. Gibson, U.S. Marine Corps. Lloyd Tatchell, Merchant Marine. Roy R. Tatchell, U.S. Army. Jesse Tatchell, U.S. Army. Michael D. Campbell, U.S. Army. Margaret I. Kennedy, U.S. Coast Guard. Bruce W. Bordeaux, U.S. Army. Zachariah Curtis West, U.S. Navy. Donald A. Inman, U.S. Army. Walter R. Rickert, U.S. Coast Guard. John Douglas III, U.S. Navy. Michael A. Kieran Sr., U.S. Army. Don R. Smith, U.S. Army. Thomas F. Babson, U.S. Air Force. Brian D. McLeod, U.S. Army.
Good afternoon once again. It's my honor, distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today, Aaron Boyle, a 2007 graduate of Wilson High School in Tacoma. Aaron joined the Army straight out of school and was married in 2008. He spent the years of 2008 and 2009 in Iraq and eventually was sent to Afghanistan in 2010, where he was wounded. Please give a welcome to Aaron Boyle. Thank you.
That would be my son. Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, retired military, active duty military, go infantry. As he introduced me, I did graduate from Wilson High School in 2007. I've been born and raised in Tacoma. After high school, I went on to join the Army. I think I had 2 weeks off after graduation. I decided that I needed to, since 9/11, I had to go and do my duty, protect this great country. After I graduated basic at Fort Benning, Georgia, I went down to Texas. I was stationed at Fort Hood. I was assigned to 4th ID 166, 1st BCT, Bravo Company. I deployed to Iraq in 2008, served until 2009. After I got back, I went down to Fort Carson, Colorado, where I was stationed for the remainder of my time, at least until my injury. I spent a year there. Me and my wife found out we were expecting our first son probably about 3 months before I deployed. I deployed in August 4th, 2010. I spent 2 weeks there. My wife went into premature labor with my son, so I went back, spent 2 weeks back at home. It's harder to say goodbye the first time. It's really hard to say goodbye the second time, especially when you have a newborn son and you didn't want to leave him. I went back to Afghanistan. In probably about 2 weeks, I was there. I talked to my wife for the last time for 5 days. I said, I love you. I'll talk to you soon. Went out on patrol. It was a day to night mission to watch for IED and placers. We stopped. There was this great tree. Saw the sunrise coming. I stepped back and stepped on a landmine. It wasn't a normal landmine. It was a Pakistani mine because their mine detectors had gone over it. And it just happened to be det corded to another landmine where my buddy was standing on. My buddy, who is still with us, he lost 3 of his limbs, both legs and an arm. He's doing great. He lives in Oklahoma. After that, life changed. I thought it was a joke. Never even thought about losing an arm and leg. We always talked about, oh, I'll come back. Nothing will happen to me. I'm invincible. Never once thought about losing an arm, losing a leg. And it did happen. And the doctors told me, I told them to get out. I thought it was a joke. Thought they were lying to me. Thought I was dreaming. It wasn't a joke. It was life. It was reality. It happened. And I had to move on from it. So they stationed me in San Antonio, Texas, where I spent the remainder of my time. Went back and forth to Colorado to see my guys come home. I did extensive rehab, had lots of surgeries to get my limbs to where they needed to be for the prosthetics. Did a lot of rehab at the CFI, down in Bampsey. We learned how to walk, learned how to use a prosthetic arm, don't really use it. It's a paperweight. Hate to say it. If you need a weight, I got an arm. Golf and my family really helped me. We moved back here, and my wife and my son have been keeping me going, keeping me active. Otherwise, I'd have probably fallen into a dark hole and just let myself rot away. But my son definitely keeps me on my toes. Keeps my wife on her toes too. Life has definitely gotten better. There's hiccups here and there, but all you gotta do is pick yourself back up and continue to drive on. At least that's what my company commander and platoon sergeant used to always tell me. Drive on. If you got pain, drive on. So it's an honor and a privilege to be here and to speak and tell you guys my story. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Thank you.
Aaron, thank you so much for sharing your unique and yet not so unique story with us. Thank you. We'll now conduct our memorial service. As long as two comrades survive, so will Key Peninsula veterans render a tribute to our heroic dead. We are assembled next to express our sincere reverence. This grave represents the resting places of many departed family members who served our nation. Wherever the body of a loved one lies, there the ground is held. Our presence here in this solemn ceremony commemorates all of the men and women, an expression of our tribute to their devotion, their duty, their courage, and their patriotism by their service on land, sea, and in the air. They have made us their debtors, for the flag of our nation still flies over the land of the free people. If you are able, please stand for a prayer by Key Peninsula Chapel.
Please bow your heads in prayer. Father of all of us, in the depth of our silence, reverence and realize the truth of our inspired words. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though we were dead, yet shall we live. As command after command, departments as we march on, with our ranks growing thinner, help us to be faithful unto thee and to one another. Look in mercy on the widows and children of our departed comrades. We beseech thee, and with thine own tender console and comfort those who are in grief. Heavenly Father, bless our country with freedom, peace, and righteousness. Through thy many favors, may we meet at the last before thy throne in heaven. We praise thy great name forever and ever. Amen.
Please be seated. Key Peninsula veterans will now pay our respects to the departed. In so doing, we offer solemn tributes to all, wherever they may rest.
On behalf of Key Peninsula veterans, I place this symbol of our remembrance.
I personally want to thank the guest speaker for being here. Thank you for your service. I place this symbol of purity. May each generation emulate the unselfish courage of all men and women who fought for freedom.
In the memory of the heroic dead who have fallen in the defense of the United States of America, I place this tribute, our devotion and everlasting remembrance.
I place this emblem of eternity. Its colors bespeak everlasting life. Thus, we do immortalize the brave deeds of our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen and Marines, who gave their lives at land, sea, and in the air.
I place this symbol of our nation. The flag of our country was theirs to defend. Its glorious colors shall wave over them in death as it did in life for everyone to behold.
A poem, Final Inspection. The soldier stood and faced God, which must always come to pass. He hoped his shoes were shining just as bright as his brass. Step forward, you soldier, how shall I deal with you? Have you always turned the other cheek? To my church have you been true? The soldier squared his shoulders and said, No, Lord, I guess I ain't, because those of us who carry guns can't always be a saint. I've had to work on Sundays, and at times my talk was tough, and sometimes I've been violent because the world is awfully rough. But I never took a penny that wasn't mine to take, though I worked a lot of overtime when the bills got just too steep. And I never passed a cry for help, though at times I shook with fear. And sometimes, God forgive me, I've wept unmanly tears. I know I don't deserve a place among the people here. They never wanted me around except to calm their fears. If you have a place for me here, Lord, it needn't be so grand. I never expected or had too much, but if you don't, I'll understand. There was silence all around the throne, where the saints had often trod, as the soldier waited quietly for the judgment of his God. Step forward now, you soldier, you've borne your burden well. Walk peacefully on heaven's streets, you've done your time in hell. Author unknown.
On behalf of the Key Peninsula veterans, I wish to thank you all for coming out today to the 2014 Isle of Honor ceremony. And this concludes today's. And I'm reminded that there are refreshments available at our concession stand. Again, thank you all so much for coming out and supporting the annual Isle of Honor for American veterans. Thank you.